Welcome to the Awakening channel. I'm your host, Peter. Today, I intend to investigate if our so-called space is indeed a vacuum. I suspect that the idea of a vacuum in space is just part of our deception by NASA and all other space agencies. If there is a space, what is it made of? Could space be filled with water or a liquid? Our education system, NASA, and science tell us that space is a vacuum. Thus, our general concept is that it is a vacuum. Are we just indoctrinated with this belief? Some basic questions have to be answered in order to find out the truth. Number one, why do astronauts train in large swimming pools? For sure, the conditions on the ISS would be totally different, as the ISS is supposed to be at 400 kilometer altitude. There is no breathable atmosphere and gravity at this altitude. Number two, why is every second being filmed while the astronauts train in the gigantic swimming pool? Nearby the pool there is a huge film editing studio. Is NASA actually faking all these spacewalks right away? Number three, why do we see bubbles in the vacuum of space when the astronauts go on a spacewalk? Number four, why do the astronauts not train in the large NASA vacuum chambers? This would be a far more accurate simulation for space. Hopefully you will find your answers by yourself after seeing my video.
The enormous vacuum chamber makes a high vacuum, which is 3 levels before the supposed much higher vacuum of outer space, as we can see here. Considering that the suits these guys here are wearing reminded me of one thing: bubble wrap. Now let's see what happens to bubble wrap if we put it in a table vacuum pump.
Oh my God, look at it! Woo! Oh.
The ultimate and most dangerous test was a huge, specially constructed vacuum chamber.
They were able to pull all the air out, create a big vacuum. That way we could test our suits to make sure there was no leakage.
One such test narrowly avoided disaster. Jim LeBlanc was the test subject in the vacuum chamber.
This is one of the rare instances where they tried to use a spacesuit in a vacuum chamber, but quickly realized that it's impossible in a high vacuum, so they immediately started using swimming pools to train and remained silent on the absence of vacuum chamber training by astronauts, which basically is a lie by omission.
As I stumbled backwards, I could feel the saliva on my tongue starting to bubble just before I went unconscious. And that's kind of the last thing I remember.
Essentially, he had no pressure on the outside of his body, and that's a very unusual case to get.
Miles up is an acoustic, so there is no transmission of sound or heat. That's what they say why the International Space Station didn't melt down so far. They are in the vacuum of space, should be no water there. You can see that they float like they are in water, and usually the legs go up because it's where they don't have weight, so they are pushed up to the surface of the swimming pool.
It seems to me that one of the greatest secrets that has been kept from us and yet given to us by NASA themselves for the last 3 or 4 decades. They constantly tell us that there's water everywhere in space. But that's not what we perceive, right? If I told you there's water in space everywhere, you'd say, well, you're an idiot. Space is a vacuum. We know space is a vacuum. There's nothing there. And yet that's not the case. And when you start researching space and water, it becomes mind-blowing. Article after article after article after press release and press release about water in space in amounts that are completely mind-blowing. Ocean worlds, water in the solar system and beyond. In 2009, NASA found a sprawling cloud of cold water vapor around a solar system at a nearby star. The water vapor could eventually deliver oceans to dry planets that are forming in the system. It's water vapor. It's not water in some weird thing. It's water vapor they're talking about here. Could eventually bring oceans to new planets forming. This is just a little disturbing. And just hold on to your faith. The famous Eye of God nebula actually weeping tears of water. Wow, so there's water coming out of this nebula. This is not just a solar system. This is a nebula. This is a place where galaxies are born. Stars and galaxies are born in a nebula. And water is coming out of this. Can you imagine the size of the water that's coming out of a nebula? It's like one drop of that will engulf our entire solar system. And it just goes on. And then water on the sun. Stanford University tells us that there's water on the sun. And even better, a more appropriately named university, Waterloo University, tells us that there's water on the sun. And I'm going to leave this here because you need to go and do some of your own research here. It seems to me that the universe and the water are the same thing. On the left is one of those deep space images of the universe. On the right is a picture of a swimming pool. And I think you start seeing what's going on here. And the lies and the deceptions are getting bigger and bigger. Also keep in mind that many of the images that we get shown by NASA come from radio telescopes, not from optical telescopes that actually photograph an object. It's a radio telescope that brings radio signals, and then they convert those into beautiful images through NASA's artistic impression graphic designers, right? So these are often you don't see pictures. These are radio telescopes. Suddenly, vacuum just becomes a myth and not a scientific fact. Because the simple basic physics of a vacuum in space just doesn't work. If there are any scientists that actually just think about this, or physicists, the whole thing of vacuum in space is just not compatible with any kind of physics formula or physics that we can put to it. Where does the vacuum begin? Vacuum is one of the most powerful forces of nature. Where does that vacuum begin? Can't do in space or in a vacuum, what you can't do in infinite vacuum is you can't propel sound, you can't have explosions, fire, propulsion, jet engines, rockets, none of this stuff. Can't do that because there's nothing to propel against. And then these guys on YouTube that make these vacuum tubes, they go, oh, look, I created a vacuum tube in my garage. I'll show you that you can propel a rocket in a vacuum. I go, really? You've lost your brain. You're comparing a fishbowl in your garage to the infinite vacuum of space? You really lost your mind, dude.
It's a process called sonoluminescence.
The first time I saw sonoluminescence was in a darkened room. I was transfixed to look at this spherical flask of fluid. And you'd look into the center, and in the center see a glowing blue-purple light, which could be seen with the unaided eye. It looked like a star in the heavens.
Seth Putterman called it the star in a jar, a tiny spot of bright light contained in a flask of liquid. This star in a jar is made when a sound wave is passed through a small bubble inside a flask of liquid. And this sound wave makes the bubble do something remarkable. First it expands, then it collapses. And this collapse happens so violently that vapor molecules trapped inside the bubble slam together and heat up so much that the bubble gives off an incredible burst of heat and light, several thousand times a second, giving the appearance of a star.
There were more surprises ahead. In the 1930s, another strange phenomenon was observed at even lower temperatures. This rapidly evaporating liquid helium cools until at 2 degrees above absolute zero, a dramatic transformation takes place.
Suddenly, you see that the bubbling stops and that the surface of the liquid helium is completely still. The temperature is actually being lowered even further now, but nothing particularly is happening. Well, this is really one of the great phenomenon in 20th century physics.
The liquid helium had turned into a superfluid, which displays some really odd properties.
Here I have a beaker with an unglazed ceramic bottom of ultrafine porosity.
Ordinarily, this container with tiny pores can hold liquid helium. But the moment the helium turns superfluid, it leaks through.
We call this kind of flow a superflow.
Superfluid helium can do things we might have believed impossible. It appears to defy gravity. A thin film can climb walls and escape its container. This is because a superfluid has zero viscosity. It can even produce a frictionless fountain, one that never stops flowing. Superfluidity and superconductivity were baffling concepts for scientists. New radical theories were needed to explain them.
So as you can see, people, that's the same exact thing you see in space, superfluid helium at close to absolute 0 degrees Kelvin. And they're shooting these lasers and particles inside this liquid helium fluid at almost absolute 0 degrees Kelvin. So let's go back to the space video. Hang on. Here's the space video.
No joy from here. Sorry. Hope it was a good one, though, for our friends.
You see a difference?
Thank you, sir. We could not see it here either. We'll wait 2 or 3 more minutes till sunrise, and then at that time give you a go for KU Stowe.
I mean, really, can you see a difference?
We're at a mission elapsed time of 7 days, 13 hours, and 17 minutes.
This is the laboratory.
Mission Control, Houston.
Look at all those stars, people. That's the laboratory video. That's not space. Here's the space video.
The Mir space station is now visible on the far left-hand side of the screen.
Here's the laboratory video.
About an inch from the bottom of this particular picture.
Here's the space video. Here's the laboratory video.
Okay, the Mir space station
Fluid
is
dynamics,
the
people.
small.
This is space, people.
We think you can see.
That's what space is. Superfluid helium at close to absolute 0 degrees Kelvin. A fluid. That's space. They're using lasers. They're using chemtrails to reflect the sun's light back up into the sky to create these particle light type environment for the celestial stars. You name it.
Spacecraft as it flies about 850
there you go, people. You saw it for
behind the sky.
yourselves. There it is. This is supposed to be space. What I showed you was in a laboratory in a control setting.
a highly magnetized neutron star. And as it is oscillating, you can see what's happening. It's shooting a radio frequency out of itself. Now, I don't know about you, but that blew me away. I'm thinking, wow, this is incredible.
The film we are about to see has no characters.
That was a little odd to me. Beautiful. Who knew?